direction from our last conversation a few weeks ago?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, now we can see quite a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, and people are still cautious. Players are still very, very cautious, but we can see the confidence is beginning to get back. Like yesterday, we saw the traffic jams back in Delhi, which is a very good kind of indicator in terms of how the economy is going to go. But when you look at statistics, for instance, like last month, petrol consumption was down by about 17.2%. Diesel was about 18%. But now what we saw yesterday, for instance, it looks like that probably in weeks to come, this is going to get back to normal. And the second very significant development is announcement by the federal government yesterday that the federal government has taken now the responsibility, including the cost, to vaccinate every single Indian. And the target is to vaccinate every single Indian by the end of this year. That's before the 31st of December. And as most economists in India, they say that the best stimulus that the government can offer is just, vaccination, vaccinate everyone. So I think this is, again, this is another very, very good step in the right direction. And this is going to boost overall sentiments. And
I might just follow up on that point, Narendra. India and other Asian countries, including China, where all of this started, have been relatively slow to vaccinate as compared to Europe and America. I'm just wondering, why has that, do you think, been common across Asia? And what's the outlook for that strategy, do you think?
Well, 2 points. Number one, and very simple, that availability of number of vaccines. I mean, vaccines that are being used in India are basically produced by two manufacturers, one in collaboration with, AstraZeneca, and the other is, domestically developed. So constraint over there. And the second is, of course, the overall network in terms of, having the cold, storage and lines and so on and so forth. So that was another problem. But there was also a bit of hesitancy on the part of number of people. But that is all gone now. After the second wave is all gone, those who were very hesitant yesterday are now at the, at the top of the queue, and they want to get vaccinated as soon as possible. So now, with the announcement yesterday, I think it's going to change significantly. Plus, India has also stopped all exports, and now we have opened up all imports, in the sense we are trying to source now vaccines from practically every market where we can source it from, except one or two countries, and you know what I mean. And so that means that we are, hopefully in coming 2 months, we will have sufficient supply of vaccine, and we hope to vaccinate 10 million people every day. So which means that by end of this year, probably the situation landscape should change very, very significantly in terms of, safety, in terms of overall economy, oil consumption, and all that. But we are still, I'm still keeping my fingers crossed, because this virus is very, very unpredictable. We don't know what happens tomorrow. So I don't want to make any prediction on an absolutely sure basis. But right now, when I look at the horizon today, it looks quite promising.
Let's welcome Robin Mills, CEO of Kamar Energy. Robin, we're seeing prices a little bit softer this morning out of Asia after, obviously, and similarly yesterday after a big week last week. Data out of China overnight showing May crude oil imports dropped to a 5-month low. Your thoughts on that? Is that indicative of a structural change in trend?
I think no big surprise, Sean. There, we'll have these little ups and downs. Look, I think the Chinese buying had been so strong, and the unloading of excess cargoes going up until the end of last year. So we're seeing some fall off from that, and then also the issue of the import quotas and the Chinese refiners, particularly the state-owned refiners, destocking. And they really stocked up when they felt crude prices were relatively low. Now seeing them relatively stronger, so choosing to draw down on their inventories. So that is, I think, a positive point from the point of view of OPEC, that again these excess Chinese inventories are being drawn down to an extent. It is something to watch, if it continues, if prices in this level are suppressing demand. But at the moment, I don't see that as a big concern. I think it's just a kind of a temporary technical factor given the way the Chinese market works.
Let's welcome John Roper, CEO of Middle East for Uniper Global Commodities. John, staying in China, we're seeing a fairly robust price point for the Asian LNG benchmark, JKM, $10, $11, something that you would typically see in the winter time. I'm wondering your thoughts on why LNG is so robust at this time and the outlook for that.
Hello, everybody. Look, Asian demand is generally fairly loose, with the exception of China, as you pointed out. And there's been a real surge of imports into China in the last, particularly in May in the last month. You know, if you think about China, China imports around 68 million tons a year in 2020. So it's going to become the largest importing country this year or next. And the figures for January and May, indicate that China's natural gas imports have already totaled about 50 million tons. And you see that sort of activity, translating into these prices. I mean, the average JKM price over March, April was about $7. But as you say, on the back of this summer demand, we're seeing spot prices, back up to 10 and nearly 11. And if you bear in mind that pricing for long-term contracts is still at historical lows, not much more than about 11% Brent, so $7.8 dollars per million BTU based on JKM, with prices at $70. Yeah, I mean, these spot prices, I mean, you've seen Chinese companies that they're slowing spot purchases. Some are taking advantage of this big move in May prices and selling on cargoes. Cargoes that were earlier due to be put into India because of COVID, the rising COVID cases there. We've seen those cargoes diverted to China to cater for this demand. It is something that we would naturally see, of course, in winter. But China is getting back on its feet quicker than most.
It might be given these fairly onerous LNG prices in the earlier part of the year and now again, that we might finally see Asia start to put the investment into the infrastructure needed in order to avoid these sorts of cycles, which they've been somewhat hesitant to do in the past around LNG. Your thoughts on that? The legacy of this price point.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, you're already seeing that. China's expanding its network of LNG regas terminals across the country. Construction plans, I think, are set to increase terminal capacity to 12 million tons. One interesting observation is that, trucked LNG has had an absolute surge. As you see that switch from coal to gas in power generation continuing. Pipeline networks take time to develop, so I think that's one of the points you're making. But in Q1 of this year, for instance, trucked LNG was estimated at about nearly 9 million tons for the first quarter, compared with 11 million tons for the whole of 2020. So there is a redistribution of LNG throughout the country, and you're seeing sale prices of about $7 in industrialized provinces like Hebei. Yeah, I mean, it's infrastructure we know goes hand in hand with the ability to distribute, and China has a lot of country to put pipelines through, and that's going to take some years.
Narendra, the last time we're just a week or a few, is it a week? I think it is a week since we had our OPEC meeting, where they fairly robustly defended $70 a barrel. The last time we were sort of shouting about $60, $65 from India's perspective. Is OPEC Plus being a little bit unwise in their pursuit of such a higher price from a consumer perspective? Your thoughts on OPEC's decision last week?
No, well, the general view in India is that anything which is, let's say, more than 63 or 64 is not very smart, because that would only push countries like India to move more in the direction of renewables, which we are already doing. And that means the message from OPEC is that you accelerate that process and also invest more in other alternative sources of fuel. So which and India, as you know, is all set to emerge as probably the largest importer of crude oil in time to come. That's what the OPEC claims. Now, if that is what they claim and that's what their view is, then I think it's important to keep in mind the sensitivities, especially in the COVID times, of importing countries like India, and which so far they have refused. But I think a bit disturbing development is that unlike during the Trump's time, the Biden administration seems to be okay with higher oil prices. That's like $65 to $70 per barrel. At least that's the impression we have in New Delhi, which means
well,
that
certainly it would fit into his climate agenda, I suppose, is that
exactly.
the burden of oil price will encourage others to look at alternatives.
Absolutely. And if it might work okay for the US and Western countries, but for India, it won't work economically speaking. Politically, maybe okay. But the point, which means that in the messages to India that we go back to the table in the sense that we actually, if you look at the figures of last 6 weeks, actually we are importing now more from Saudi Arabia. We were trying to cut down and having started importing more from the US, more than even Saudi Arabia. Now we have gone back to Saudi Arabia. We are going back to the Middle East in a way, in the sense that, in the given situation, probably we will have to have our own dialogues with Saudi Arabia, because for us, OPEC actually means Saudi Arabia. And so our whole idea is now to look at the whole thing and to have more bilateral discussions, and so that they can see the point, or at least can there be some special deals between India and OPEC countries, most particularly Saudi Arabia. So there are a number of areas being explored.
What about Iran? I mean, Iran barrels coming back. Is India ready, willing, and able?
Well, India, as you know, that we have got a couple of refineries which were actually designed for only Iranian crude. They have been modified since then, but that said, at the same time, I mean, we are just waiting for Iran to open up, because Iran is a very, very important country for us. It's a gateway for us to Afghanistan and to Central Asia. So it's a very crucially, very strategically, very important country. But that at the same time, the US is more important. And we will wait for the US to basically, US and other Western key countries.
While you wait, though, China is getting very embedded there. You might want to wait too long. Robin, OPEC meeting last week, were they being a bit too cautious in holding back, at least signaling supply increases in the second half of the year? I mean, we have the OPEC Secretary General overnight saying the demand outlook, stocks are falling, everything is happy days.
Yeah, look, I think keeping on their path was sensible enough. I think nobody really expected them to make further increases in production at this point.
But signaling beyond July, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the interesting thing we're looking forward to, because the 3-month phased increase in production obviously is almost over, just 1 month to go, and we need to know what happens after that.
And we're trading August.
Yeah, sure, and prices are strong, and inventories have drawn out significantly. I think we'd say that OECD inventories are normal now, if not even tilting towards falling below normal, and as we noted, Chinese inventory has been drawn down a bit as well. So that possibly is a bit of a missed opportunity to signal what happens next. I think, having been burnt before, perhaps they're a bit cautious and just wanted to keep everybody on the road that they're on so far, and not to open up any disagreements. It was an exceptionally quick and short and uncontroversial OPEC meeting, the last one. But certainly the next one will have to lay out a path for, you would think, further production increases. But I think, as I also pointed out, they were also concerned about Iran, and Iran is a significant unknown factor. They might know more next time. There might be some more news on the nuclear talks, and if it looks strongly like Iran is going to be coming back to the market, then that obviously would inform their decision of how much oil they need to bring back.
On the sort of regional issue, Robin, we have another article in the Digest today about the Kuwait having to burn more crude oil for power, given the heat surge we've seen in the region and expecting this summer above 50 degrees. And we know, of course, Saudi Arabia burns quite a bit of liquids for its power generation. Could that be another source of demand this summer?
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, Kuwait, obviously, as we've noted, will burn more oil over the summer. They're also trying to increase LNG imports, but they're still constrained on how much they can bring in. That's a kind of a moderate factor. I think the Saudi factor would be bigger. We will expect strong demand this summer, particularly if the heat wave continues, of course. But as we saw last year, with people not being able to travel, the demand in the Gulf was unusually high. Nobody really leaving. I think again, we wouldn't expect people to be traveling much this summer either. So you may see stronger demand in Saudi than you normally would. That said, there's also a lot of extra gas being made available in Saudi Arabia with new gas projects coming online earlier this year. So that should temper the amount of crude oil burn they require.
John, we see comments overnight as well by the BP CEO, and not often we see him talking about strong oil demand these days. He's usually talking about his latest wind farm or what other point of transition he's committed to. The majors have been through a pretty significant week in terms of sort of activist investor pressure and also increasing transition pressure. What do you think is the outlook for that on the majors, and what are the consequences for the NOCs in this region, do you think?
I think a point that Robin has made on numerous occasions is really worth bearing in mind, that the world is going to need oil for a considerable length of time. It's not really a case of jumping into this energy transition and oil demand just disappears in a short period of time. So I think you're going to see those IOCs that are making commitments towards this transition are going to have to pay for that transition with the production of their oil and gas, and that's very much how they set their stall out. Total Energies has moved very quickly into the renewable space, and it is clearly been building up its gas inventory as opposed to oil over the last few years. The litigation that we are going to see, I mean, it's certainly a blow morally, if you like, for IOCs, and they're going to have to learn how to deal with that in the courts. It's a shame that it's gone to courts because someone like Shell, if we look at the information that's out there in the public domain, Shell is investing a considerable amount of money in its transition, and in some ways, a litigation like this from the courts is going to be counterproductive, I think.
I mean, your company, Uniper, is born out of the sort of structural shift in the industry, isn't it? Ultimately, E.ON partner, your former company, and then created a split off of the different sort of clean, not so clean assets. Do you think that is a model that might be imposed on others, the majors and elsewhere?
Look, I think Uniper is predominantly a utility. We're not an oil and gas company, so oil is hardly in our portfolio.
But coal was before, obviously. But
yeah, and we've taken the decision very early on to get ourselves out of our coal-fired power business earlier than the German government had initially stipulated. So we're continuing to make that move. And as a company, we've taken on decarbonization wholeheartedly, and our company has made some very strong commitments to decarbonize its entire power generation business by the early part of 2030, and so you're going to see companies doing what they can do, and IOCs will do what they can do in that oil space.
But I think in some ways the lesson learned by Uniper, I mean, what your sort of example essence is getting out in front of these curves rather than like Exxon and others who are being dragged into a space that maybe they lose control over, literally with 3 board members being imposed on them in the last week. I don't. It's in that way. I think there are lessons from your experience in getting out in front rather than being dragged. But we'll see where that plays out. Narendra, India is on everybody's don't fly list. I mean, we know a little bit about what that feels like here in Dubai and the UAE, but I'm wondering from India's perspective, being essentially cut off from the world in that regard, what are the consequences of that? How do you see that lasting?
Well, I think probably this will go soon. I mean, majority of Gulf carriers are still flying, and we have regular flights to Europe, including the UK, and those who can afford. So it's a roaring business for private jets these days. So and similarly, we have connections with the Southeast Asia, and we hope that this will get back to normal. Because don't forget one thing: for carriers like Emirates and Gulf and Singapore Airlines, Indian market is actually a huge market, very significant for the overall bottom line. And at the same time, with the kind of indications we have now and the announcement of new policy initiatives in terms of vaccination, and overall number of cases being down, like in Delhi, is down to just 300 cases.
I mean, the last time we talked on that point, Narendra, is the data point itself. Can we rely? I mean, the general consensus was that the data point on infections was only a small percentage of the actual infection rate. We were last talking about rural India being, in a way, a black hole of no data. How much can we rely on that data that you're presenting or that India presents versus the reality?
Well, you see, I mean, when you look at data, I mean, we're a democracy, very open country and free press. The fact that what was being reported by international press was all coming from Indian press and Indian newspapers, especially small town newspapers. And those were being picked up by international, including CNN, BBC, New York Times, and all that. They were not doing reporting from the ground. They all work out of their apartments in Delhi. They are my colleagues and my friends, and I can share that with you. So now, which means you can't hide. You can't hide data. They can be delayed because reconciliation at the municipality level, at the village level, takes long time. But so you can't hide. Ultimately, you have exact data. For instance, what happened 3 weeks ago, now we have the exact data because the figures have been reconciled. So I think, what is being said now, being reported in the media, is closer, let's say, to the exact situation than what it was, let's say, 4 weeks ago or 5 weeks ago, because reconciliation is faster, and the mortality rate and all that has gone down. Number of cases have gone down, and we can see also there's reports coming from villages and small towns. So overall, as I said, that I'm still very cautious. Media and we all talking of the third wave, and the governments are preparing across the country, state government, for the third wave, likely third wave. So this time the government is taking no chances, whether federal or the state government. So it seems that everybody is prepared, including the people. But that at the same time, when you look at the overall picture, probably there would be no third. We don't know, but the country is well prepared for that. But I think vaccination campaign is going to make a huge difference.
Seems like your third wave might be in Sunderland and not in New Delhi, with the Indian variant spreading in that corner of the world. But nonetheless, I think you're right. We all have to have some strategy for continuous waves. And it seems the only one really is vaccinations. Robin, before we come to you next, I'd like to go to the survey question and just get the view from the room on this Chinese import data overnight that has been published at a 5-month low. Question is, does it confirm weakness in Asia markets, or is it temporary, cyclical, because we've just had the maintenance season on refineries? What is the view in the room? Chinese oil imports at a 5-month low, structural weakness in Asia market, or temporary, cyclical? And we'll see a climb from here. Robin, the other factor the market continues to contend with when it sort of focuses on the glass half full sentiments, and that is Iran. Where are these Iranian talks going? They seem to be like the Duracell battery, going on and on and on. Are we in the final innings here? Will there be a deal? What are your thoughts?
Look, I think no surprise it took a while, Sean, because these talks are very complicated. And, I think the situation had moved on so much since the last deal was struck, and there's a lot of political changes and a lot of domestic political pressures on both the US and Iranian sides. Now, I think there's a few interesting things to watch. I'd say on the US side, one interesting thing to watch, as you just mentioned, is the oil price. Now, we may say that Biden, for his environmental agenda, would prefer higher prices, but he's a very practical politician, and he knows that high gasoline prices are not a good thing for him, and getting Iranian oil back on the market is, in that sense, is a plus. On the Iranian side, it's interesting, of course, because the presidential elections are coming up very soon, in about 2 weeks' time, and then possibly a runoff if there isn't a clear winner in the first round a week after that. That runoff would come just the day after the next OPEC meeting. So that's worth watching what OPEC will know about those elections. And then the Rouhani administration will remain active until early August, until they would hand over to a new administration. So, so they've really got until early August to settle this. And I think there's a bit of a game going on. Who can take the credit for getting back into the JCPOA? So I think that I think there will be an Iranian return to the JCPOA, whether it's under Rouhani or under his successor. Question is which one of them seals it and which one then tries to get the credit. And the Iranian elections are pretty interesting. We'd thought that it was going to be a coronation of Raisi, the hardline judiciary chief, who had been very much handpicked and not a popular figure. But we thought that the elections would be much more circumscribed this time, much less choice. But in the first debate, the let's say the lone credible reformist candidate put up a good show. Not a very well-known figure, the former central bank governor, but put up a good fight, and Raisi didn't look impressive at all. So, we should be perhaps a little bit open to the idea of a surprise in the Iranian elections, or another perhaps contested election in which there are doubts over the legitimacy of the winner. And then it's a question: who does he have the political? Whoever the winner is, does he have the political strength to then really carry through that the remaining negotiation of the deal if there's more to be done, and then the implementation? I think it's always been the case that a hardliner would have a harder time reaching an agreement with the US. But once an agreement is reached, you'd have an easier time selling it at home. And conversely, if it's a moderate or reformist winner.
It's hard to see that Rouhani at this stage would have much wiggle room for, moving away from a very tight parameter around what he can concede in final talks. Would you think he has fairly limited ability to steer away from what has essentially been the deal 5 years ago?
Yeah, quite limited. I mean, there won't be any, any kind of follow-up. There's the idea of this kind of more for more deal, and then further negotiations on other issues. Now, that was supposedly always the idea of the Obama deal, that it was just the first step, and then there'd be talks on Iran's regional activities and trying to settle some of these regional conflicts, and that never happened, of course. That would be a hope now, but I mean, I think if it's Raisi or another conservative who wins, I think you can forget any further talks. I think it'll be very simply JCPOA, lift the sanctions, nuclear activities are frozen, but no serious further talks on any of these issues. Yeah, I think the supreme leader has made it quite clear that the space is open for a deal. On a return to the deal basically on the same parameters, plus a few fixes for what's changed in the meantime.
Let's get the survey result and see where the view temporary cyclical by a long shot. John, your thoughts on that from the point of view of Asia continues to be the growth market to support all commodities, and that trend line ultimately has not been adjusted?
I think what we'll see is a continued improvement in commodities out of countries that are coming out of the COVID space and recovering. China's clearly going to continue to drive this. As we see other countries coming on board, that cyclical nature that Robin talked about, will be up and down. I don't think it needs any sort of further rationale, really.
Narendra, on that point, I mean, you mentioned earlier now that India is putting forward a fairly robust vaccination campaign, but without it, we saw obviously 6 months ago India performing incredibly well. Even if it doesn't succeed in the vaccination campaign, or Asia as a whole doesn't get to the sort of vaccination rates that we're seeing in Europe, can we still expect India to be a big demand center in the coming year without a real vaccination success?
Well, first of all, I think vaccination campaign would be a success for the simple reason because we are going to source most of these vaccines from within the country. India is a major manufacturer of vaccine, and people are prepared to have them. The government has shown the willingness, and there is money. So I see absolutely no reason, for instance. There may be a bit delay of 2 or 3 months, not by the end of this year. It may really go on till the middle of next year and so forth. But I think overall, things are moving in the right direction. And secondly, where India or China, Indonesia or Southeast Asia and other countries in the region, I think, the gravity center as far as the oil and gas or the energy as a whole is concerned has already moved to this part of the world. I mean, and just wait for some time, it's going to be led by this part of the world. Unfortunately, I mean, these countries are not able to come on the same page and lead it just because serious differences between India and China, China and Japan, ASEAN and China and Indonesia and other countries. So that's precisely the reason. But I think if they could come together, at least in terms of energy, in order to lead the overall global energy governance picture, I think this can really make a huge and significant difference. But right now, you've seen just for instance, India and the US are very close. India, Japan, Australia, they have come very close in terms of a platform called the Quad. And you have seen President Putin's comment, he's calling it Asian NATO, which means that there are going to be serious differences, and that may also reflect in terms of how the energy landscape evolved in our part of the world. So there are many ifs and there are many kind of, fault lines which need to be looked into before we can. But overall, to me, it looks like whether it's called One Asia, United Asia, or Asia Together and all that, but Asian countries as a whole individually are going to be make a huge, huge difference. And I see China, India, Indonesia, a smaller country like Pakistan, Bangladesh, ASEAN countries, I think all going to change the landscape quite significantly when it comes to hydrocarbons, but also in terms of the renewable energy.
Yeah, it seems like it's going to be some bit of a challenge to watch, however, with countries that are not in a position to vaccinate over the next 6 to 12 months, that we will get continuous rolling disruptions in Asian demand, which may, obviously have an effect on where consumption and getting back to sort of that pre-2019 levels, if indeed Indonesia shuts down for a month or India gets back into a shutdown and so forth. But we'll have to wait and see. It's one of the issues out there. Listen, John Roper, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And Narendra, as always, really appreciate checking in from India. And Robin, thank you for your time and engagement. And everybody else, have a great week, and we'll catch up with you in the coming days. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Sean. Bye.
Cheers, guys.